Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into the Articles of Confederation, which is our first constitution here in the US. And then we're also going to talk about our transition to our US Constitution, which we have now. So if you haven't, go ahead and pull up the note sheet from yesterday. You should have everything filled up about the Declaration. We did that in class yesterday. So again, make sure that these pink sections are completed because those are the required parts of this formative assignment that you'll turn in on Friday when it's completed. All right, for now though, today we are going to start with the Articles of Confederation. So here we go. All right. So yesterday when we talked about the Declaration as one of our first founding documents here, really it wasn't any sort of setting up of a government. It was more of a announcement to the world that, hey, this is what we stand for, and these are the things we believe that a government should stand on. These are the philosophies that we want to follow, the principles that we have as Americans, and these are the ways that, and then they listed those grievances. These are the ways that the King and Parliament in Great Britain have gone against this. And so, therefore, we want out. We want out of this relationship. We want to start up our own country based on what we believe. So if you need a quick review on that, open up the slides, and there's several videos in there that can kind of lead you through a quick review of what we did yesterday. Once then the declaration was made, keep in mind, remember, the war had already been going on for over a year. So the fighting was already set. But now the task was to do two things. One, to organize a continental army, an army based on all of the colonies working together. So they would still have those local militias that work together in their local communities, but then they also had a larger continental army. And so George Washington was in charge of that, so he went and he took care of that. Meanwhile, many of the rest of those founding fathers stayed put in Philadelphia for a while, and they're going to set up their first version of a constitution, our first attempt at putting this into practice. And they called it the Articles of Confederation. So what is the Articles of Confederation? It's our first constitution. So they eventually signed it into being in 1777. So, it took several months to get this figured out. And essentially what the purpose of the articles was to make a government that united all of the colonies together, now states, all the states together, but also allowed individual states to kind of have their own freedoms to do what they needed to do locally. Unfortunately, what happened is they made it too weak. They wanted to make sure it didn't resemble anything like a monarchy. They wanted to make sure that nobody felt threatened by this new government that they were forming. But unfortunately, without a lot of central authority, it just wasn't going to last long term. So let's just take a look at what the U.S. actually looked like at this time period. So this is the U.S. right after the Revolutionary War. And so you can see the states there lined up. The pink would be those settled territories. And then at the end of the war, we'll talk about, we get all the land to the Mississippi River, technically. So you have all those frontier areas. And there weren't many people at all living in those frontier areas that were part of the colonies. European descent people were not pushing west yet. Mostly those would be Native American tribes, some that had been there for a very, very long time, and some of them that had been pushed out of these settled areas. Right? And we'll get into that later the year. That's going to cause all sorts of problems for the tribes themselves and for the settlers as well. So the good news about the Declaration, right? You got this chart in your notes, good news, bad news. Here's the good news. One, it helped us gain our independence. It allowed the states to have the freedom and the ability to do what they needed to do to defend their local areas. So that was great. The other thing that we got in there was a system set up of how to organize that unorganized areas, all those orange areas in that map. Right, so all three. Specifically looking at this area we call the Northwest Territory at that time. Of course, now we call it the Midwest. Right, here we are, right here. All right. So it's going to create a system for new states to enter the Union, right? So we have our 13 original in there, but what happens when someone else wants to add? We organize this territory. So they set that system up. They're also going to ban slavery on of any kind in that Northwest territory, and that is a big deal. You had actually read a book on this over the summer. You had people that very intentionally wanted to make sure that slavery was not expanding into that part of our country, at least because that's where they're from. They felt um, tied to that. Also set up and established that there is a freedom of religion in this country. And at this time, it was mostly like different forms of Christianity, but also ensuring that that happened when you spread into those unorganized territories as well. So that freedom of religion was for all parts of the U.S., not just the states. The bad news, and you can see there's more bad than good here. So we've got a few things to take a look at. First of all, to pass a law, there's only 13 states, and so every state is going to get one vote. Right? Doesn't matter how many people live there, doesn't matter the physical size of the state, every state gets one vote. And to pass any law, 9 out of those 13 have to vote yes to pass those laws. So one vote per state. Now, if you want to physically change the Constitution itself, the articles of itself, every single state, all 13 states, have to agree. So it has to be a unanimous decision. Now, if you know anything about politics, you probably know that to have a unanimous decision is very, very difficult. And so that's going to be a problem that they run into going forward. There is only one branch of government. They only have a legislative branch. So there are no executive branches. So executive branches would be our central leadership, so president, vice president, all those cabinet positions. So that does not exist, and mostly for that was the fear of not wanting to look anything like a monarchy. They wanted to make sure it didn't look like they had a king of any sort. Also, there was no judicial branch, so there were no federal laws that were enforced by the federal government, by the national government. Instead, there were only state and local judges and judicial branches. So the states and the local governments were in charge of that. The problem with that is there was nobody to hold the states in check to make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Also, no federal law enforcement. What that means is no military. There's no U.S. military under the Articles of Confederation. Individual states had their own local militias, but what ends up happening is because there's not one overarching U.S. military, if something were to happen in the country, it would be up to individual states to volunteer their troops to do that. So, for example, if we go back to this map here, oops, I'm going the wrong way. All right, if we go back to this map here, there was an incident called Shays Rebellion. It took place up here in the north. And with Shays Rebellion, you had a number of Revolutionary War vets that were falling on hard times. There were lots of issues happening, and they rebelled against the government. But unfortunately, there was no U.S. military to go in and fix this, and so they had to ask individual states to volunteer troops to try and put this rebellion down. Well, if this is a problem up in here, right, and you live down in South Carolina, the chances are you're not going to sacrifice your own South Carolinians for a problem up north. So there oftentimes weren't enough troops to handle this situation. So this is going to be a wake-up call for political leaders saying, hey, maybe we need some kind of unified force to protect not just our local communities, but the entire country as a whole. More bad news. So this was all the political stuff, the stuff with the government itself. Now we're looking at economic problems with the Articles as they move into this time after the Revolution. No taxation. So there were no federal taxes, which as a taxpayer sounds awesome, except that also meant that our federal government had no money to pay back debts, no money to run programs to benefit the entire country. The fear was that if you start asking states for money, they would get mad and they would just leave the country. Okay. No common money to say. States were allowed to have their own currency. So if you can imagine that today, every time you go to a different state, you would use a different type of money. And that would be really, really cumbersome. I mean, think about how we live today. You run down to Chicago and you need a different type of money. You run over to Minneapolis, you need a different type of money. It would get very, very cumbersome and just difficult to do business more than anything, not even just for us, like regular people moving from place to place. People back then didn't really move like that around. But for business aspects in the economy, it was very, very cumbersome to have all those different types of currency. All right, and then, like I said before, the no federal law enforcement, no military, all of this is going to be bad for the economy as well. So Daniel Shea, like I said, up in Massachusetts there, he starts a rebellion. And they want lower taxes. They want to stop having people foreclose on their farms. They want to be paid for their work in the revolution. And what was happening is because all these farmers were falling in debt, and they didn't have money, they were throwing them into jail until their debts were paid. And it's hard to pay your debt when you're sitting in jail. And so these guys, they looked at themselves as Americans, as patriots. Many of them had sacrificed a lot for the start of this country physically in the war itself, and they felt like they weren't being respected for that. And so they rose up and for over a year really caused havoc in the area. And so this, again, was a wake-up call, not just for the military aspect, but also for the aspect that, hey, we got to find a way to look out for our people economically as well. There has to be a system in place where people are paid for what they deserve, and we need to check our taxes, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of the American people economically as well. All right, so we're going to pause right here and watch this video, and it'll take you through a quick summary of what we just talked about.
In the U.S., we love our Constitution. But it wasn't always this way. Before the Constitution and government we have today, we had a sort of prototype Constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which created a nation of independent states only loosely linked together by a single Congress. The Founding Fathers intentionally designed a nation with a very weak central government. There was no judicial branch, no executive branch, so there was no president, which when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You know, the colonists had just been through a really bad breakup with the British king, and they're not about to get back together with a government who looked just like their ex, okay? We've all made that mistake before, okay? You go and date a girl like the last girl you dated, you're gonna get hurt, okay? Don't do this to yourself. The Congress, which was just a single chamber with a delegate from every state, did have some power, like the authority to make treaties and alliances, maintain an army, and coin money. But they couldn't levy the taxes to pay for those things. In fact, under the Articles of Confederation, paying federal taxes was voluntary for the states, who of course were like, no thanks, we're good. The U.S. had borrowed money from European investors and nations to pay for the Revolutionary War, but with no power to tax, the United States couldn't pay back any of those debts, creating a huge economic disaster by 1787. With no funds and limited power, the central government couldn't do much to protect peace at home. This became abundantly clear during Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when farmers in Massachusetts violently protested against the state's high taxes. So if the Articles of Confederation weren't working, why didn't they just make changes to it? Well, it was practically impossible. Amendments to the Articles needed unanimous consent, and the delegates from the 13 states had more opinions than a YouTube comment section. By the way, you should comment on this video right now. Say something nice about it. This weak Congress and a broke, ineffective federal government eventually proved to be too much of a burden on the United States. Because when 13 different state governments held all the power, nothing was getting accomplished. The Founding Fathers found this out the hard way. So they went back to the drawing board, drafting a new and improved Constitution, which is still the law of our land today.
All right, excellent.
Getting elected president is an
All right. So the result. The articles were a failure, and that became obvious in a lot of different ways here. And so there really was two choices. They were either going to have to fix them, which, because of the way the articles were set up, was going to prove to be very difficult. To have unanimous vote of how they're going to fix them just isn't going to work. So the other choice was to get rid of them. But this was going to be difficult because they needed to find a new system where you're going to unify the country in a more American sort of way, but also keep the states happy. So the states agreed that they're going to meet again in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to discuss what to do next. What's the next step? So let's pause right here, and in your notes section, take a second and go ahead and answer this question. Why were they so worried about keeping the states happy and not offending them? Go ahead and pause this video if you need to, and then we'll move on. So the Articles of Confederation really set up the government to look like this. So in a system, just a vocab word for you, a system in which you have a federal or a national government and a government that includes states or local governments is called federalism. Now you have a federal government and you have a state government working together. So under the Articles, the version of federalism that we had, lights went off in my room. The version of federalism that we had looked like this. The states had tons of power. The federal government had very, very little power. And so we had to balance this out more. We wanted to be the United States of America, right? Not the United States of America. We needed to change that emphasis away from the states. The states were still important, but focus it more on that united part. And so we get rid of the those politicians that get rid of the Articles, and they're going to replace them with the Constitution that we still have today. Now, it was a long process. It was not an easy process to get through this and to this, because these guys are all coming from different areas. They have different things that they want to emphasize and different things that they are important for America based on who they are and their backgrounds and what they've experienced. And so they have to find a way to compromise all those things. Most people in America thought, and they knew these guys were meeting, but they thought they're going in just to modify what was already there. Nobody really anticipated that they were going to completely scratch the whole thing and start over. But in the end, when they come out on the other side, this is more similar to what we have today. This idea of federalism, where states and federal government are really seem to have equal power, working together with a little bit of overlap there. So we're going to pause and get into this with this video here.
It's a very short document, which, by the way, I have a copy of, just to show you how small the Constitution is. This is the Constitution. It's a very, very, very small document that's no longer than a term paper. In 7 articles and 27 amendments, it creates the entire blueprint for our government. It identifies the actors, the institutions, the processes, and the ground rules by which we as a society choose to live.
So once you understand the Constitution, you really understand the essence of how American government was designed.
At the time of the writing of the Constitution, it was a brand new notion that people could figure it out for themselves. We could govern ourselves.
You know, we had been a colony of Great Britain for a couple hundred years, and we didn't really like the experience.
We had always left it up to people who were in aristocracy, the monarchy.
One of the founding principles of the country was to limit the power of the national government. And that's still in our political DNA today.
The Constitution is a remarkable document in that it's lasted us over 200 years. Many other countries have experimented with representative democracy, and they've had far more constitutions than we have. When they wrote this document, they wrote a document that was flexible enough to let it stand the test of time.
It was never ever meant to be etched in stone. I have these very, very conservative professors. They were rather old. They felt that the Constitution was divinely inspired. Let me get this straight. You are telling me that the writers of the Constitution were divinely inspired to have slaves. That's where my interest in the Constitution kicked off. Because I said, if it can be wrong about one of its major principles, how else might we critique it?
All right. Excellent. So with that, we get into the Constitution here itself. And it's broken into 3 main parts. as we get into this. So you have the preamble, and what we learned with the Declaration of Independence is that preamble is just another word for introduction, explaining the purposes, why are we here, those types of things. Then you have the 7 articles, and the articles themselves are going to break up the different parts of the government. And next year in civics, you'll dive into specifically what is in the Constitution itself. But Article 1 will be the legislative branch. Article 2 will be the executive branch. And Article 3 is going to be that judicial branch. Then 4, 5, 6, 7 are going to break into how do those 3 branches work with the states. It's going to lay out how that overlap, that relationship, if we go back to our Venn diagram, it's going to work. How does this overlap work? How do they work together? Who's in charge of what? And then you have the amendments. And the amendments we're going to look at in more detail actually tomorrow in class. But really the amendments are an opportunity for changes, flexibility as time changes, as people's opinions change or needs change within the country. We can add these in, right, going forward. And of course, those first 10 amendments are going to be that section we call the Bill of Rights that were added all at once within a couple of years. So highlights to know about the Constitution. First of all, it's a government based on this idea of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is basically meaning the popular vote. It's based on this idea that people have a say through voting in how their government works. It's also based on this idea of separation of powers, taking the 3 major powerful parts of a government, the leadership, executive branch, the legislative, the lawmaking piece, and the judicial, the courts, or that piece that's making sure people are following the laws, right, and separating that power out. You go under a king, right, King George, he had all 3, right? He was the leader, he was the lawmaker, and he was the judge and jury, right? Now we're going to separate that out, so they have to work together just to make sure that nobody's getting too much power. Remember, that was one of the biggest fears that they had, was that one part or one person or one group was going to have too much power and blow the whole thing up. Another highlight to know about the Constitution is that this power is also divided between national and state governments. We've talked about that with federalism. So not only are they dividing up power within the federal government, but also dividing it between the federal government and the states, right? Taking that power, giving it to lots of different people, so people are forced to work together. Another thing that they had was that the president was forced or would be chosen by the Electoral College. And so basically what that means is there are a group of people that are dictated, applied, get the right to be part of the Electoral College. And they basically take what the popular vote is within a state, and then based on that, they make the final decision of how that state is going to vote. And today, most states just go along with what the popular vote is within that state, but it's kind of broken down as far as how many states get how many Electoral College votes. So when you watch the election coverage in November, they'll talk a lot about the Electoral College and how that works and how many votes each state gets and how that adds to the total number that they need. So again, you're going to get details on that process in civics next year, but for now, just know they were very intentional in dividing up that power, but also making sure that the popular vote just doesn't run away with who the leadership is, that there was a final check to make sure that it was an educated choice. Electoral College is very, very controversial today, whether it is something that we should still have or not. All right, a few compromises that came into this. Obviously, you're going into it, and you have people from many different states coming in with many different intentions and what they feel are our needs. And so there's a few great compromises that end up in the Constitution that have a long-term effect on what we're doing. The first one is just, they call it the Great Compromise, which is how the legislative branch is set up. The idea with the Great Compromise is that you're going to have 2 branches of the legislative branch, right? The Senate and the House. And the House is going to be picked based on number of people in your state. So if you have a big state, you're going to have a lot of people in the House, right? The Senate then is going to be a compromise where every single state gets 2. Doesn't matter how many big how big it is, doesn't matter how many people live there, every single state has the same. And so that was catering to both large states with large populations and also small states with small populations, both having kind of equal representation based on those two things. So that was the Great Compromise. Other compromises really fell around this issue of slavery. You really don't see the word slavery in the Constitution at all, and that was intentional, right? Very, very intentional, and they worked around it. A couple of places you do see it. Those slave owners really wanted to be able to count their slaves as people, which is super ironic, right? Because they were treating them as things, and they wanted to count them when it benefited them as people, right? That is wrong, just like slavery is wrong. So you had one proposal where if you had a slave, they counted as one person, and you had, those without slaves saying, hey, like, why would you count these as people? And so they compromised it. And so every slave, for every 5 slaves, you'd get 3 votes of people. They call it the 3/5 compromise. So it's basically counting every single slaves as 3/5 of a person in the country's population. It was super messed up and stuck around as long as there was slavery, unfortunately. The slave trade was also talked about in the Constitution and giving it a final date to ban international slave trade. So we're looking early 1800s. They officially say we're done. The slave trade from other countries is done. They could freely trade within the U.S., but there was no longer bringing slaves from the Caribbean or from Africa over to the U.S. And that was very intentionally put into the Constitution as well. Again, it's a compromise. Lots of people wanted it to be done right away. Others didn't. And then the Fugitive Slave Law, and this we'll hear again later when we get closer to the Civil War. But a Fugitive Slave Law was just a federal law saying if a slave runs away, you have the right, you have to, as an American, turn that slave in if you know that they're a runaway slave. And it is a federal law. So as these ideas came up, we're going to already, early on, early 1800s, we're going to start to see the country break into sections, fraction itself, based on their political beliefs. Historians don't necessarily call this a political party yet, but they're definitely political factions with people falling into 2 different groups. And the 2 groups we're going to look at, and you're going to fill this out for one of your required sections of your notes here, are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So let's look at some of the main differences here. The Federalists are going to believe in a strong federal government, right? They want that authority within the national government to manage and bring unity to and equality amongst the states. They believed that the Constitution should be ratified as it was, straight up as it was. And some very popular Federalists, at least early on, were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And these guys actually took it upon themselves to write a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, where they're going to promote the Constitution, specifically in New York, where they're trying to get the state of New York to agree to this new plan. The Anti-Federalists then, not Federalists, not a very original names we have here, but helps us see just how opposite they are. They believed in strong states' rights. They were concerned that the federal power was going to be too much and it was going to fall into what they had previously. They're going to agree to the basic ideas of the Constitution, but they want a part in writing saying we are going to guarantee individual rights, right? And so because they wanted that, they would only ratify it if we added amendments to the beginning, which we now call the Bill of Rights, that specifically lay out as an individual, these are my rights as American in writing. All right, so you should take a second here, and this is not what it looks like on your sheet, but go ahead and fill out what are the 2 differences between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and how, as you do that, I'm going to have you watch this video for a few more details.
1787, the Constitution was complete and ready for ratification. Almost. Ratification means to make something official by signing it or voting for it. And to ratify the Constitution and make it the supreme law of the land, 9 of the 13 states had to approve of it. In the end, it took more than a year and a half to get 11 states to ratify and nearly 2.5 years to get all 13 to ratify. During this time, 2 opposing groups emerged, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were in favor of ratification. They felt the Constitution was already complete as it was, and were in favor of a strong central or national government to keep the country running smoothly. The Federalists were mostly wealthy businessmen living in large trading cities along the coast. They included the founding fathers Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, and John Marshall. They explained how the Constitution would work by publishing a series of newspaper articles known as the Federalist Papers under the false name Publius. The Anti-Federalists were against ratification of the Constitution. They feared a strong central government would be too much like a king and wanted a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution that would guarantee people the freedoms they had fought so hard for in the Revolution. They were less organized than the Federalists and consisted of common people living in both the cities and the countryside. Some of the better-known Anti-Federalists include John Adams, Samuel Adams, George Clinton, and Patrick Henry. At this time, only Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut had voted in favor, giving the Constitution only 5 of the 9 states needed to ratify. The Federalists realized that to get the other states to ratify, they were going to have to add a Bill of Rights. After promising the addition of a Bill of Rights, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire cast their votes. With 9 out of 13 states on board, the Constitution wasn't ratified for the entire country, but did go into effect in those 9 states. At this point, the 2 biggest and most economically important states had yet to ratify, Virginia and New York. George Washington, Edmund Randolph, and James Madison worked hard to convince Virginia to ratify, while Alexander Hamilton set his sights on New York. A few months later, in the summer of 1788, Virginia and New York officially voted to ratify the Constitution, bringing the count to 11. Though North Carolina and Rhode Island eventually came around, with 11 out of 13 states, the Constitution was ratified and became the supreme law of the land. Let's review. The Federalists were for ratification. They felt the Constitution was complete and they were for a strong central government. Usually they were wealthy businessmen. In contrast, the Anti-Federalists were against ratification. They were afraid of a strong central government and wanted a Bill of Rights. They were mostly common people. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, and John Marshall were all Federalists. John Adams, Samuel Adams, George Clinton, and Patrick Henry were all Anti-Federalists. In the end, the Anti-Federalists won out and a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution.
All right. So we are going to specifically be talking about the Bill of Rights tomorrow, but wrapping this up with the Constitution here today. September 17th, 1787, you get 38 of those 41 delegates are going to sign that Constitution. The Constitution is approved, but with any major change, it has to go to the states as well. The states have to agree to this, and that is still true today. Anytime we add an amendment, right, it has to go to the states also. There'll be times when the federal government actually passes some amendments and the states don't approve it, and so then the amendment fails. But it really goes in with that premise that we are going to add those Bill of Rights. So James Madison gets started right away writing those Bill of Rights, and like I said, we'll get to that tomorrow. By 1891, you have those Bill of Rights created. They become part of that Constitution that we have today. It takes a couple years for all those states to ratify it, and it is a big push. A few do it right away, but you have some convincing to do in some states like Virginia and New York. Becomes that last one with a huge push from guys like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison writing those Federalist Papers, right? So if you have watched or listened to Hamilton, the musical at all, they'll talk about the Federalist Papers quite a bit in a section of that. All right, So tomorrow we are in class. We are going to go and get into what are the Bill of Rights. We're going to take a look at 5 of them specifically tomorrow and help you gain a greater understanding for them. So make sure you wrap this up. Make sure you have completed the pink, at least the pink sections of this note sheet, but of course use the entire thing to make sure you get the vocab and the information that you need down on your sheet. And we're going to end right there, right here, and we'll pick up with the Bill of Rights tomorrow. Let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise, we'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.